Alex stepped into the enormous exam hall, his heart racing a little. He had never seen so many different kinds of aliens in one place. From the towering, six-legged insect-like creatures to the tiny glowing beings who hovered in the air, the room was filled with beings of all shapes, sizes, and colors. They were all preparing for the most important exam of the year, the Intergalactic Intelligence Test, which would determine the smartest species in the galaxy. As Alex looked around, he noticed the aliens were all doing something that made him feel a bit uneasy. They were all sitting at their desks, adjusting the neural interfaces they wore like headsets. These interfaces were designed to connect directly to their brains, boosting their intelligence and allowing them to solve complex problems in seconds. The aliens didn't need to think hard. The neural tech did all that heavy lifting. Alex didn't have any such device. He had refused it when they offered it to him. He didn't want to rely on technology. In his mind, humans were capable of great things without the need for any fancy gadgets. He believed that a sharp mind and clear thinking were all he needed. But now, standing in the middle of the exam hall, surrounded by species who thought nothing of using technology to boost their intellect, Alex started to feel self-conscious. One alien, a tall creature with silver scales and piercing blue eyes, turned to look at him. It wasn't just a glance. It was more like a stare. "What's this?" The alien's voice came, smooth and deep. "No neural interface. How do you plan to survive this exam, human?" Alex swallowed but didn't let the mockery show on his face. He simply smiled. "I'll manage. I trust my brain." The alien laughed, its voice echoing through the room. "Your brain. In a test against technology. That's cute." It wasn't just one alien. A few others, seated nearby, turned to look at Alex, shaking their heads. They whispered to each other, obviously amused. "He's going to fail," another alien murmured, this one covered in shimmering green fur, its voice light with laughter. Alex didn't let their words bother him. He knew the truth. Humans were underestimated all the time. People didn't realize how capable they were without advanced tools. After all, his species had survived countless challenges throughout history, from natural disasters to war, and they had done it with their own resourcefulness. The aliens continued to snicker among themselves as they settled into their seats. They put on their neural interfaces, adjusting them until they fit perfectly. The devices glowed with soft blue light, linking them to their minds, ready to give them the edge in the test. Alex felt a small pang of doubt, but he pushed it away. He could do this. He was a human. The human mind was stronger than they realized. The exam began. The room was silent except for the soft sounds of aliens typing quickly on their desks. Alex glanced at the first question on his screen. It was a logic puzzle, something humans were particularly good at solving. He took a deep breath and began to work through the problem, focusing on each step, letting his mind process the information naturally. Around him, the aliens were moving fast. Their interfaces were working at top speed, answering questions in the blink of an eye. Some of them barely even had to think before selecting the right answer. It was as if the technology was doing all the work for them. Alex couldn't help but notice how they seemed almost robotic, each one tapping away without pausing to think, as if the answers were just being fed directly to their minds. But that wasn't how Alex worked. He didn't rely on tech. He relied on himself. He kept moving through the problems, one after another, without rushing. The aliens, however, had begun to show signs of frustration. Their screens flickered every now and then, as if something was wrong. Alex caught a few glances of nervous looks from the aliens around him. They were struggling. The interfaces were giving them too much information at once, making it difficult for them to focus. Alex didn't know it yet, but the aliens' over-reliance on their neural devices was going to be their biggest mistake. As they sped through the test, they were missing important details, failing to properly analyze the questions. They didn't realize it, but the very technology they depended on was starting to confuse them. Meanwhile, Alex kept his cool. He smiled to himself as he solved each problem, carefully thinking through every step. No tech, just his brain. But the aliens were still watching him, some with pity, others with outright disdain. They couldn't understand how someone could be so slow. To them, it seemed impossible that anyone could finish the exam without using neural interfaces. As the minutes ticked by, Alex kept working steadily, blocking out their whispers, their mocking looks. The countdown clock on the wall ticked down to the final moments. The aliens around him were still typing away furiously, trying to finish. Some looked frustrated, some desperate. But Alex was already done. He took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, knowing he had done his best. And now, all he had to do was wait. The room went quiet. The soft hum of the exam hall was the only sound, and the countdown clock on the wall ticked down the seconds. Alex sat at his desk, eyes focused on the screen in front of him. He could hear the faint clicks and taps of the other aliens as they typed furiously, their neural interfaces buzzing with activity. He was calm. He trusted his mind. On the other hand, the aliens around him were a blur of motion, their hands moving with speed and precision. They barely glanced at the questions on the screen before their fingers moved like lightning. Their neural interfaces were working at full power, feeding them answers in real time. For them, this exam wasn't a challenge. It was almost like a game. The advanced technology made it easy. Alex, however, refused to use the neural interface. He had been offered one before the exam, but he politely turned it down. "I'll be fine on my own," he told the exam officials, who had raised their brows in surprise. To them, it was unthinkable that anyone would even consider taking the test without such technology. But Alex was determined to prove a point. He believed that humans had something special that no technology could replace: a sharp, clear mind. The first question appeared on his screen. It was a complicated logic puzzle, something that would challenge even the smartest beings in the galaxy. Alex's fingers hovered over the keys. The puzzle involved patterns, sequences, and abstract thinking. For a moment, Alex paused. It wasn't that he was unsure. It was just that he wanted to understand it completely before jumping in. That was his approach. Take it slow, think it through, and don't rush. Around him, the aliens were already typing. Some of them barely paused to read the question. Their interfaces were doing all the thinking for them, calculating and solving in a fraction of a second. The screens flashed with numbers and symbols, and answers were selected almost as if by instinct. For them, there was no need to ponder. The answers were already in their minds, fed by the technology. Alex felt a little different. His approach wasn't about speed. It was about understanding. His eyes moved slowly across the screen, processing the information bit by bit. He thought back to the lessons he had learned as a child, how his teachers had always told him to take his time and never rush. He applied that same lesson now. Minutes passed. The aliens around him were racing ahead, their movements almost robotic. Alex was still on the first question, but he wasn't worried. He felt confident that, with time, he would arrive at the right answer. The more the aliens worked, the more Alex noticed something strange. Some of them were starting to make mistakes. One alien, a small creature with soft, glowing skin, typed in a sequence that was clearly wrong. Its interface buzzed, showing a red warning. The alien frowned, backtracked, and tried again, but it couldn't seem to fix the mistake. Another alien, a tall being with 4 arms and a shimmering silver body, was also struggling. Its eyes flickered between the screen and the interface, looking confused. The tech wasn't helping. It was just confusing them even more. Alex raised an eyebrow. He didn't understand it at first. Why were these aliens, who relied so heavily on their neural interfaces, having trouble? They had the advantage, didn't they? But the more he looked around, the more he realized that the problem wasn't with the questions. It was with the technology. The neural interfaces were too fast. They were feeding the aliens answers before they could fully think them through. The alien students were rushing to keep up, afraid of falling behind. And in doing so, they were making careless mistakes. They were trying to finish too quickly, relying on the technology to do the work instead of using their own reasoning. Alex, on the other hand, was still moving at his own pace. He took a deep breath and glanced around. He saw a few of the aliens looking frustrated. One, a large hulking creature with red scales, slammed its fist on the desk in frustration. The interface had suggested an answer that didn't make sense, and now the alien was stuck, unsure of how to proceed. For Alex, it was almost like he had an advantage. The more the aliens rushed, the more they stumbled. Meanwhile, he worked through the puzzle step by step, feeling his way through the problem. He was careful. He wasn't just trying to get it right. He was trying to understand why it worked. That, he realized, was the key to solving these kinds of problems. As time passed, the tension in the room grew. The aliens, who had been so confident at the start, were now visibly stressed. Their interfaces buzzed with error messages, and their screens flashed with incorrect answers. They were trying to correct their mistakes, but they couldn't keep up. Alex, on the other hand, was still calm. He finished the first question and moved on to the next one. His mind was clear, his thoughts focused. He wasn't just answering questions. He was solving problems, using the power of his own brain. As the exam continued, Alex couldn't help but notice how the aliens were starting to glance at him. They had been mocking him earlier, but now their expressions were different. Some were surprised, others curious. No one was laughing anymore. The more they struggled with their tech, the more they seemed to respect his approach. Alex smiled quietly to himself. Maybe, just maybe, the human mind wasn't as outdated as everyone thought. The countdown clock ticked down, but Alex knew one thing for sure. He was not going to be the one to panic. The rest of the aliens, on the other hand, were a different story. The exam hall was filled with the soft sound of tapping keys and the occasional hum of alien interfaces. The first round of questions had been challenging, but Alex had moved through them with ease. His eyes stayed focused on his screen, calmly answering each question, taking his time to think. Around him, the other aliens were still typing furiously, their interfaces flashing in a blur of light. But something strange had started to happen. Alex could feel it in the air. The aliens who had once seemed so confident were now showing signs of distress. The quiet murmurs of frustration began to fill the room. One of the aliens, a creature with 4 arms and a long, slender neck, slammed a fist on the desk. It had made an error again. Its glowing interface buzzed with red error messages, and its screen flashed quickly, trying to suggest an answer. But the answer didn't make sense. The alien stared at the screen in confusion, trying to adjust the settings. Next to Alex, a tall, thin alien with skin like glass, covered in intricate patterns, was shaking its head. The interface it wore had begun to glitch. It buzzed loudly, showing multiple calculations at once, and the alien tried desperately to make sense of the chaos. But no matter what it did, the answers didn't seem to match the question. The alien's face, usually calm and collected, was now twisted in frustration. Alex couldn't help but notice the aliens' growing panic. They were struggling. The technology they had once trusted so completely was failing them. The neural interfaces, which were meant to make the exam easier, were now making things worse. The aliens had relied so much on the devices that they had forgotten how to think for themselves. Meanwhile, Alex moved steadily through the questions. He hadn't made a mistake yet. He was focused, calm, and patient. He didn't rush. Each problem, no matter how difficult, was just another puzzle to solve. His mind was clear, free from the distractions of technology. He understood what was happening now. The other aliens were too dependent on their interfaces. They were relying on their tech to think for them. And now that it wasn't working, they were losing their edge. The confusion in the room was growing. The hum of the alien interfaces grew louder as the creatures tried to fix their errors. The tall, four-armed alien next to Alex was now muttering to itself, clearly flustered. "This isn't right," it whispered. "The interface is malfunctioning again." Alex kept his eyes on his own screen, blocking out the noise around him. He had seen something like this happen before. Alien technology was powerful, but it wasn't perfect. In fact, sometimes it could get in the way. Alex's advantage wasn't in his speed. It was in his ability to think clearly without the interference of technology. As more time passed, the aliens became more and more anxious. One of them, a small creature with large, bulbous eyes, looked like it was about to cry. It kept pressing buttons on its interface, trying to reset it, but nothing worked. The screen kept showing error messages, and each time it tried to fix one, another one popped up. Alex glanced up from his screen for just a moment, watching the chaos unfold around him. He felt a little sorry for the aliens, but he couldn't help but feel a bit smug too. They had all laughed at him for not using the neural interface, for being too old-fashioned. Now, it seemed, they were paying the price for their over-reliance on technology. But Alex didn't want to get too confident. The test wasn't over yet. There were still many questions to go, and he needed to stay focused. He could feel the tension building as the countdown clock ticked down. The aliens around him were now visibly panicked, glancing at each other, their faces tight with stress. Their screens flickered and buzzed with warnings. One of the aliens, a tall, insectoid being with 6 legs and a chitinous exoskeleton, slammed its interface onto the desk in frustration. "This is impossible," it hissed. "The calculations aren't working." Its 4 eyes were wide with panic, and it began to tear at the straps of the neural interface, as though the device itself was to blame for its failure. Alex kept moving through the questions, his mind sharp, his thoughts clear. He noticed that the aliens around him had stopped typing so rapidly. Some of them were sitting back in their seats, their eyes closed in frustration. They were trying to calm themselves, but it was clear they were starting to doubt their ability to finish the test in time. He glanced down at his screen again. The next question was a tricky one. It was a math problem that involved several steps, but Alex didn't panic. He calmly broke the problem down into smaller parts, solving it piece by piece. He knew this was where the aliens were struggling. They weren't thinking critically anymore. They were just trying to keep up with their malfunctioning technology, and that was a dangerous mistake. Time was running out. The aliens were starting to whisper nervously to each other. Their screens flashed erratically, and the exam hall was filled with the sound of frustrated mutterings. The last few minutes of the test were quickly approaching, and Alex could see it in their faces. They were losing their confidence. But not Alex. He was still moving steadily through the exam, his focus unbroken. The confusion around him only fueled his determination. He knew that the more the aliens struggled, the more they would realize something important. That technology couldn't replace the power of a clear mind. The room was thick with tension. The soft hum of the exam hall was now interrupted by the occasional sounds of alien devices malfunctioning. Alex kept his focus, his fingers moving steadily across the keys. He had been working at his own pace, calm and sure, while the aliens around him were falling into chaos. Their faces were a mix of confusion, frustration, and desperation. The countdown clock was ticking, and every second felt heavier than the last. Alex glanced around the room. The once confident aliens, who had mocked him earlier for not using the neural interface, now seemed unsure of themselves. Some were staring blankly at their screens, their interfaces buzzing with error messages. Others were frantically pressing buttons, hoping for a solution that didn't come. One alien, a tall, muscular being with shimmering purple skin, was visibly shaking. Its large eyes darted back and forth between the screen and the malfunctioning neural interface. The alien's breathing grew heavy, and its once smooth movements had turned jerky, as if it couldn't control the panic that was rising inside. Alex didn't look away. He knew that this was the moment when everything could change. The test was almost over, and it was clear that the aliens were struggling more and more with each passing minute. It was almost as if the technology they had relied on so heavily was now betraying them. The quiet mutters of frustration turned into louder voices. "What's wrong with this thing?" One alien shouted. "I'm losing time." Another one slammed its fist on the desk in frustration, the sound echoing through the hall. Alex could hear the panic starting to spread, and it made him feel even more confident in his decision to rely on his own mind. But as the tension built, Alex's focus never wavered. He finished the current question and moved on to the next one. His fingers moved fluidly, solving each problem with ease. The questions were getting harder, but he didn't mind. He knew that if he took his time and thought carefully, he would get the answers right. The aliens, on the other hand, seemed to be getting worse with every passing minute. One alien, a small round creature with bright yellow eyes, was visibly shaking. It had begun to sweat, its tiny body covered in nervous beads of moisture. The creature kept pressing the reset button on its interface, trying to get it to work. But each time, a new error message appeared on the screen. It was clearly losing its composure, and its once confident expression had turned into one of pure panic. Alex couldn't help but notice how the alien's face was flushed with anxiety. The creature was still trying to fix its device, but it was becoming clear that the tech was beyond repair. The alien had become too reliant on it, and now that it was failing, there was nothing it could do to catch up. Alex shifted his attention back to his screen, feeling the pressure rising but refusing to let it affect him. He had been through harder situations. He had learned long ago that the key to success was staying calm when others around you were losing control. The tension in the room was palpable. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The countdown clock continued to tick down, and Alex could see that many of the aliens had already fallen behind. They had spent so much time trying to fix their interfaces that they were now losing valuable moments. The more Alex watched, the more he realized how big the gap between him and the other participants had grown. He wasn't just ahead of them. He was moving at a pace they couldn't keep up with. He wasn't even sweating. His mind was sharp, and he trusted it completely. One of the aliens, a massive creature with thick, green scales and sharp claws, let out a frustrated roar. It had thrown its neural interface to the side and was now glaring at the screen, as if blaming it for its failure. The alien's massive hands clenched into fists, and its chest heaved with angry breaths. But there was nothing it could do. The exam was still going, and time was running out. Alex glanced at the countdown clock again. There were only a few minutes left. He had almost finished the exam, and he knew that, despite the alien's panic, he was going to be the first one to submit his answers. The thought made him feel a surge of pride. He had chosen to rely on his own mind, and it had paid off. As the final seconds ticked down, the room seemed to hold its breath. The aliens were now in full panic mode. Some were pacing around, muttering to themselves, while others were frantically typing in a last-ditch effort to finish. The once confident beings who had laughed at Alex for not using a neural interface were now struggling to finish in time. The countdown clock reached 0. The final buzzer sounded. Alex took a deep breath, leaned back in his chair, and clicked the submit button. The room was still for a moment, as if time itself had frozen. Alex felt his heart race, but he kept his expression calm. He had done it. He had finished. Around him, the aliens were still trying to finish, their screens flashing with error messages. Some had barely completed half the exam, while others were still trapped in confusion. Alex knew he had succeeded. He had done something that the others hadn't. The simple act of trusting his own mind, free from the interference of technology. The room was eerily quiet after the buzzer rang. Most of the aliens were still staring at their screens, their faces twisted in frustration and panic. The exam was officially over, and Alex leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of relief and pride. He had finished before anyone else, and he knew it wasn't just luck. His calm, focused approach had made all the difference. He looked around the room, taking in the sight of the other participants. Some aliens had stopped typing altogether, their eyes wide with disbelief as they stared at their malfunctioning interfaces. Others were frantically typing away, trying to finish the exam, but the clock had already run out. Alex felt a small sense of victory, but he knew this was only part of the challenge. There was still the final result to come. The exam hall was silent for a long moment. The tension from before was still hanging in the air, thick and heavy. The aliens seemed unsure of what to do next, unsure whether their efforts had been enough to finish in time. Alex knew that it wasn't just about finishing the exam. It was about how well you could perform under pressure, and the others hadn't done well at all. Suddenly, the screen at the front of the room flashed to life. A new message appeared for everyone to see, causing Alex's heart to skip a beat. It wasn't the result of the exam. No, this was something far more unexpected. ALERT. Final exam results will be delayed. Due to technical errors, all participants must reattempt the exam. Instructions to follow. Alex blinked in confusion. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the other aliens stared at the screen in shock. "What?" one of them whispered. "How is that possible?" The small, round alien with yellow eyes, who had been shaking earlier, was now standing up in disbelief. "We've all finished," it protested, looking around at the others. "How can the results be delayed? We passed, didn't we?" The room filled with murmurs as the aliens began to argue. Something went wrong with the system. Another alien with long tentacles said, "But we should be finished. We solved everything. Why should we have to retake it?" Alex leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He had expected a simple result, but this was far from what he anticipated. What was going on? Was this some sort of mistake? Or was it part of the exam, some trick designed to test them further? As the aliens debated, a new message appeared on the screen, making Alex's stomach twist with confusion. "Attention! All neural interfaces are being temporarily disabled. Please stand by." A ripple of surprise spread across the room. What did this mean? Alex glanced at the others. The aliens who had been relying on their neural interfaces were now looking around nervously, as if they could feel the shift in the atmosphere. And then, the screens in front of them flickered off completely. The exam room was plunged into silence. Alex's heart began to race. What had just happened? The technology that had been the alien's lifeline was now completely gone. He hadn't used the neural interface, but he knew this could throw off everything for the others. Without their tech, they were lost. Some of them started to fidget nervously, clearly unsure how to proceed without their devices. He heard a loud gasp. The tall, muscular alien who had been so anxious earlier looked like it was about to lose control. It reached up to its head and began tugging at the neural interface as if trying to remove it. But the interface had completely shut down, and no matter how hard it pulled, it couldn't get it to work. The small round alien with yellow eyes stood frozen in place, its face pale. It didn't know what to do anymore. Without its interface, it was helpless. The creature had relied so heavily on the technology that it had no backup plan. Alex, however, remained calm. He didn't need the technology. The rest of the room was filled with the sounds of panic as the aliens tried to figure out what had happened. Some of them were frantically pressing buttons on their devices, but nothing was responding. Others stood up, pacing back and forth, muttering under their breath. And then, as if it was a cruel twist of fate, the lights above flickered and dimmed. The overhead monitors buzzed and blinked in an eerie pattern, and the large doors at the back of the room creaked open with a loud metallic groan. A figure stepped through the doorway. It was one of the exam supervisors, an alien with a sleek, robotic body and glowing blue eyes. The supervisor stood tall, its metal arms folded across its chest, as it surveyed the room with an unreadable expression. Its robotic voice echoed through the silence. "All participants are to follow new instructions. The exam was never about your technology. It was about how well you could think without it. Now, you will be tested again, but this time, you will rely on your own skills. Prepare yourselves. Alex's eyes widened as the implications of the announcement sank in. The exam hadn't been about using the technology at all. It had been a test of their ability to think without it. The aliens around him, who had relied so heavily on their interfaces, were now starting to panic in a whole new way. Without their devices, they were completely lost. They had never been trained to think independently, and now they were facing the consequences of their over-reliance on technology. Alex couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. The twist had caught everyone off guard, but he had been ready. He had prepared for this moment, even if he hadn't known it would come. He trusted his own mind, and now it was clear that it was the one thing that would set him apart. The room buzzed with nervous energy. The aliens, who had been so confident just moments ago, were now frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The robotic supervisor's announcement still echoed in their minds. The exam hadn't been about technology after all. It was about how well they could think for themselves. Alex sat quietly, watching the chaos unfold. The aliens around him were still trying to reboot their neural interfaces, frantically tapping at their devices, but the screens remained dark. The small alien with yellow eyes was wringing its tiny hands, pacing back and forth. The tall, purple-skinned alien was growling under its breath, frustration evident in every movement. They were all in shock. The one thing they had relied on, technology, was no longer available to them. They had never considered the possibility that their advanced systems might fail, but now that they had, they were scrambling for answers. As the tension grew, the doors at the back of the room opened again. This time, the person who walked through was not just another supervisor. It was the head of the exam, the alien professor. The professor was a tall, imposing figure with sleek silver skin and glowing green eyes. Its presence immediately commanded attention. The moment it stepped into the room, all the noise stopped. The aliens fell silent, their gazes locked onto the professor. They knew this was the one they had to impress. This was the being that held the power to decide their fate. The professor's voice echoed in the room, calm but with an unmistakable authority. "It seems some of you are struggling," the professor said, its voice laced with amusement. "But don't be too upset. You're not the first to face such challenges." The aliens exchanged confused looks. What was the professor talking about? They had never faced anything like this before. They were used to being the ones in control, with their advanced technology at their fingertips. But now, they were vulnerable, and it was obvious that they didn't know how to handle it. The professor looked around the room, its green eyes scanning each alien one by one. "You all rely so heavily on your technology," it continued, "but you forget the most important thing. Technology is a tool, not the answer. It's your mind that holds the true power." Alex couldn't help but smirk to himself. The professor's words hit a nerve with the others. They had underestimated the importance of thinking independently. They had placed too much trust in their gadgets, and now they were paying the price. The professor turned its gaze toward Alex, and for the first time, a hint of surprise flickered in its eyes. "And you," it said, voice suddenly sharp, "you finished the exam without even using your neural interface. How is that possible?" Alex didn't flinch. He had expected the question. In fact, he was ready for it. He knew this was his moment to prove that the humans weren't just lucky. They were resourceful. He stood up, looking the professor in the eye. "I trust my mind," Alex said simply. "I don't need a device to tell me what I already know." A small smile tugged at the corner of the professor's lips, but it was clear that this wasn't what the professor had expected to hear. The aliens around Alex were staring at him now, some in disbelief, others in confusion. They had never seen anyone approach the exam like this before. The professor's eyes narrowed, as if trying to understand Alex's mindset. "You're saying you didn't need the neural interface?" it asked. Then why did you even come to this exam if you didn't intend to use the technology? Alex shrugged. Because the test wasn't about the technology. It was about what I could do without it. And I think that's something you've forgotten. The professor was silent for a moment. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. The aliens watched the exchange between Alex and the professor, unsure of how to react. They had never seen an Earthling speak so confidently in front of one of their most respected leaders. Finally, the professor spoke again, its voice softer this time. You may be right, it admitted, as if processing the idea for the first time. Perhaps I underestimated you. But understand this, technology has its limits. It's only as good as the mind behind it. Alex nodded, his confidence growing. Exactly, he said. I've learned it the hard way. Technology can fail, but your mind never will. Not if you know how to use it. The professor studied Alex for a long moment before finally nodding slowly. You have a unique perspective, it said. Perhaps humans are more resourceful than I gave them credit for, but don't get too comfortable. There are still many tests ahead. The real challenge is how you handle the next one. With that, the professor turned and walked toward the exit. The aliens in the room remained still, processing the unexpected turn of events. They had come into this exam with the belief that technology was everything. But now, they were faced with a reality they hadn't prepared for. Alex watched the professor leave, feeling a sense of pride swelling inside him. He hadn't just passed the test. He had shown the aliens something they hadn't expected. He had proven that it wasn't the technology that made you smart. It was the mind. And that was something that no amount of advanced gadgets could replace. As the room settled back into an uneasy silence, the aliens began to turn to each other, murmuring quietly. They were beginning to understand the lesson Alex had taught them, whether they liked it or not. The professor might have been shocked, but Alex knew this was just the beginning. The room had fallen into a tense silence after the professor's departure. The aliens were no longer arguing or scrambling to fix their malfunctioning devices. Instead, they were deep in thought, processing everything that had happened. Alex could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. The challenge was far from over, but he had already made his mark. He had proven something they hadn't expected. As the minutes ticked by, Alex stood still, watching the others. Some of them were still adjusting to the fact that the technology they had depended on had failed them. But Alex wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the next step, the next challenge that awaited them. The alien with yellow eyes, the one who had been pacing nervously earlier, finally approached Alex. It looked up at him, its face no longer filled with panic, but with something else. Respect. I never thought about it like that, the alien said quietly. You didn't rely on the interface. You trusted your mind. It paused for a moment, as if trying to fully understand what Alex had done. Maybe we've been too dependent on our technology. Maybe you're right. Alex gave a small nod. He could see the change in the alien's demeanor. It was no longer mocking or dismissive. It was beginning to understand. And that was the first step. Around the room, other aliens began to approach him, one by one. The tall, purple-skinned alien, who had been so frustrated during the exam, walked over with a slow, deliberate pace. I have to admit, it said, its voice rough but not unfriendly. I thought you were crazy. Who doesn't use the interface during an exam? It let out a short laugh. But now I see. Maybe you have something we don't. Alex smiled, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The point had been made. The aliens were starting to realize that there was more to intelligence than just relying on technology. It wasn't about having the most advanced tools. It was about using what you had to its fullest potential. The others were slowly catching on too. The small, round alien with the nervous energy was no longer fidgeting. Instead, it stood tall, its posture a little straighter. Maybe we've forgotten how to think for ourselves, it admitted, looking around the room at its fellow aliens. We've been so focused on using our tools, we forgot what it feels like to just think. Alex could see the change in the room. The atmosphere had shifted. The tension had melted away, replaced by something new. It was as if the aliens were realizing that their reliance on technology wasn't the answer. It was the human way of thinking that had given Alex the upper hand. The way he had approached the exam, not with advanced gadgets, but with his own knowledge and intuition, had been the key to his success. The robotic supervisor, who had been standing silently at the back of the room, now stepped forward. It wasn't a living being, but even it seemed to have a new understanding. This exam was meant to test your adaptability, it said, its voice devoid of emotion, but with an undeniable hint of respect. Alex has proven that he is adaptable. He passed this test in a way none of us anticipated. The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't from confusion or fear. It was from admiration. The aliens had been humbled. They had seen firsthand how a human had faced a challenge without relying on the same tools that they used every day. And they had learned something important, that the mind, when used correctly, was more powerful than any interface. As the minutes passed, the aliens slowly began to return to their seats. They were no longer eyeing Alex with suspicion or doubt. They were looking at him with something different now: respect. There were no more whispers or sideways glances. Instead, they nodded at him, acknowledging his achievement. The alien with the long tentacles, who had been the most vocal during the exam, was now looking at Alex with a thoughtful expression. "You're not just clever," it said quietly. "You're resourceful. You didn't need the technology. You just used your brain. That's something we've forgotten to do." Alex nodded again. "Sometimes we all forget. But in the end, it's about using what we have. And the most powerful tool we have is right here," he said, tapping his head lightly. The atmosphere in the room was now completely different. The aliens had come in with a sense of superiority, relying on their advanced technology to see them through. But now, they were humbled. They had seen what true adaptability and resourcefulness looked like, and it had come from the human who had refused to follow the usual path. As the supervisor made the final announcement to wrap up the exam, Alex felt a sense of pride swell within him. He hadn't just completed the challenge. He had changed the way the aliens saw the world. They had come to understand that intelligence wasn't just about tools or technology. It was about how you used your mind to navigate the challenges that life threw at you. The professor might have been shocked at Alex's success, but in the end, it was clear. The respect he had earned wasn't just for his skills, but for the mindset that had made all the difference. The aliens may have had their advanced technology, but Alex had something they hadn't counted on: his ability to think beyond the limits of what they had always known. As Alex left the exam room, the aliens watched him with a newfound respect. He had proven them wrong. And in doing so, he had taught them the most important lesson of all: that true strength comes from within.